Welcome to the League of Women Voters League Days 2021. This session will be discussing the social justice and equity issue of fines and fees and the campaign to end debtors prison in Delaware. My name is Cami Seward, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters, Newcastle County, and also the campaign to end debtors prison. As I hope you've heard, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization dedicated to the belief that democratic government depends on informed and active participation in government. Social justice and equity are centrally held values that guide the work of the League of Women Voters. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning as we focus on the need for legislative action to reform Delaware's current system of fines and fees. Before we get started, I want to go over a few things. So as audience will be muted, but after Miriam's initial presentation, we'll begin taking your questions. Let's see, you can either put your question in the chat box or use the raised hand function. Do people know where the raised hand function is? All right. Or also, we've decided that this will also work if you want to raise your hand in that way. And I want to thank Kim Wells and Kira Hoffer this morning for providing our tech support with all of this. So thank you. All right, now let me introduce our terrific and inspiring panel. Miriam Dede is a co-coordinator of the Network Delaware's campaign to end debtors prison. You may know that this grassroots effort to advance state legislation to fix our current harmful system of courts and fines and fees. As I said, you may know that. She works as an assistant public defender, practicing primarily in Delaware's Court of Common Pleas, but before becoming a public defender, as a graduate of the University of Virginia School of Law, Miriam was an associate at Young, Conway, Stargett, and Taylor in their corporate litigation practice. Lynn Keelhorn these days is a full-time citizen advocate. She and Miriam co-coordinate the campaign to end debtors prison, working to eliminate the connection between poverty and the criminal legal system. Lynn spent her career in biotech, most notably as a co-founder of NanoDrop Technologies. And Lynn is currently in leadership roles in the Delaware Poor People's Campaign, the Peace and Justice Work Group of Westminster Presbyterian Church, as well as Delaware Greenways. She is active with the Coalition for Smart Justice and currently serves on the Community Policing Subcommittee of the Law Enforcement Accountability Task Force. Tanya Whittle is Dr. Tanya Whittle and a visiting assistant professor of sociology and criminal justice at Delaware State University, and also a member of the campaign to end debtors prison. Tanya earned her PhD in sociology with concentrations in law and society and criminology from the University of Delaware. She studies criminal justice policy, prisoner reentry, and legal consciousness, evaluates criminal justice and social service policies and programs, promotes data-driven evidence-based policies and practices, and facilitates collaborative efforts or initiatives between academia and the community. Prior to joining the faculty of Delaware State University, Tanya worked as the Research and Planning Coordinator for the Delaware Administrative Office of Courts, a Mental Health and Justice Fellow for the Delaware Department of Corrections, and a research assistant for the Center for Drug and Health Studies. Panel, thank you again for taking your time to be with us this morning to address this pressing issue. Miriam?
Hi, everyone. So as Cami said, my name is Miriam Dede, and I'm with the Campaign to End Debtors Prison. I'm gonna throw up my slides for you. So I wanted to take a minute at the beginning before we get into the nuts and bolts of fines and fees in Delaware to tell you a little bit more about our campaign and also frame the issue we're going to be talking about today. The Campaign to End Debtors Prison is a grassroots campaign. We used to meet every other Wednesday in the annex off of the SSAM church in downtown Wilmington. We now meet over Zoom. We've become a little bit more high tech, but ultimately we are entirely made up of volunteers. We have people in our campaign that are directly affected by the issue that we're going to talk about today. We have people that work in it. We have people that care about it. And we welcome everyone. So if any of you feel inspired after this presentation and after everything that we have today, feel free to reach out to us because we are always looking for more volunteers. So our mission as a campaign is to create a world where one's poverty doesn't affect how they are punished in the justice system. We want to achieve that with two goals. The first is to eliminate fees in the justice system. And the second is to ensure that fines are fairly imposed. So to get into the justice system a little bit, I kind of wanted to give everyone some framework. So can anyone tell me what building this is? You can put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and call it out. Any guesses? And I realize I can't actually see the chat right now.
Wilmington Courts.
Here we go. This is the Newcastle County Courthouse. This is where everything happens in Newcastle County. So on the top level of the building are judges' chambers. Directly beneath that are the courtrooms where chancery is held. Below that is Superior Court, then the Court of Common Pleas, then Superior Court again, then Family Court, and finally at the bottom is Dunkin' Donuts. This is where my entire legal career has been. I know Cami gave a little bit of background about me, but I started off my career as a chancery litigator with a big firm in Delaware, and then I made a switch and I'm now an assistant public defender. When I talk to people about the time in my life when I was practicing corporate law, I often describe it as my former life because it truly feels like I've lived two different lives. And that's because my perspective on the world, my perspective on the law, on my life and my life in relation to other people has completely changed since I've become an assistant public defender. When I practiced in chancery, I would file things electronically, usually just before the stroke of midnight. I think the deadline for filings has changed now, so it's 6 p.m. Hopefully everyone has slightly better bedtimes than I did when I did chancery litigation. But we would file just before the stroke of midnight, and I would go to bed knowing that I was being paid money to handle people's money and to fight in the courts over their money. And I always knew what was happening. I knew the status of their case. I knew the status of the fight. If I didn't know at any moment, I could look it up easily. Now that I'm a public defender, my clients don't pay me, and they often have no idea what's happening with their money. And often when they ask me, I cannot tell them because I don't know either. So when I practiced chancery and when I was a kid and when I was in school, this is kind of how I thought about the law. I thought it was a lot of people in suits. I thought it was high tech. And I thought that, it was this very, very structured system where ultimately there was justice. Ultimately, even if there were some wrong decisions along the way, things came out fairly. Now, I think about the justice system a little differently. This is more how I think about the justice system. It's a crushing caseload. It's a lot of cases, and it's a lot of people usually doing their best, usually trying to do what's right, but mistakes are made. And sometimes those mistakes are funny. This is a real image taken, it's a real image that was flyers that were in the courthouse I just showed you. It was just from last year. But you know, sometimes those mistakes are funny and they happen, and it's just, that's a part of life. We've all had typos, but sometimes those mistakes are compounded with other mistakes. They're compounded with people shutting their eyes to injustices. And sometimes those mistakes are life ruining. And that's really what we're talking about today, a series of little changes and little things adding up to really, really crushing results on people. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tanya to give a little more context.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you to our hosts and everyone that's in attendance this morning. So the segment that I'm about to go through, I'm going to be doing a crash course on Criminal Justice 101. Some of it you are probably already familiar with, but I want to go through it anyways, just to make sure that we are all on the same page and have shared vocabulary, so that as Miriam and Lynn speak about specifically what's happening in Delaware, everyone has a better understanding of what they're saying. But I also want to cover some of these quote unquote basics, because even those of us who have learned all of this in school and who work in these fields, it's quite easy to forget about some of the basics. And oftentimes I will hear people say, well, why is it like this? You know, why don't they just? And sometimes it's, you know, because, hey, it's easier to not do something than to do something. But a lot of times it's because, well, this particular organization doesn't have jurisdiction, or, you know, it's something that has to do with legislation and not court rules. And so we can oftentimes be mad at the system, but focusing our anger at the people that are just right in front of us. And so I'm hoping to give some context for everyone, so that, as I said, when Miriam and Lynn focus really on the Delaware specifics, we'll all be on the same page. So with that, Miriam, next slide, please. And again. All right. So first off, as you know, we are from the Campaign to End Debtors Prison, and the overall goal is for us to, you know, make changes so that one's income level, one's involvement in poverty does not influence their engagements in the criminal justice system and how the criminal justice system processes them. Right now, we're focusing particularly on addressing fees and fines that come from criminal justice court cases. And I want to make sure everyone's clear that although we oftentimes talk about fees and fines or fines and fees, they're actually different things. You'll hear people use them interchangeably, but technically they're not. Technically, a fine is a monetary amount that is charged to a defendant as a punishment, right? All right, you jaywalked, your fine, you know, is the ticket amount of, you know, I don't know, $100. I'm just making that up right now. Fees are separate from that fine, and they are monetary charges to the defendant that are intended to compensate the courts or collect revenue for other government services. So we frequently will talk about court fines and fees because the courts assess and collect them, but the money isn't just going to the courts. For instance, there are fees for DELGIS, which is our criminal justice data system. But keep in mind, fines are the punishment monetary amount, and fees are those surcharges that we keep our system going with. Miriam? And so as we think about fees and fines in Delaware and do we need reform, a big part of that is, okay, well, is our criminal justice system working? And a big part of that is, well, is our criminal justice system just? And this isn't an easy answer because there's a lot of normative values that are built into justice. What is just? And there's even different forms of justice. You know, there's this idea of procedural justice, treating every case and person just alike. And then there's a concept of distributive justice, recognizing that different situations are unique and that if we treated everyone just alike, we would have very unequal outcomes. So distributive justice is looking more at, all right, do we have equity versus just equality? And you can see in this image here, although we talk about equality and equity and justice in these very flippant terms, the reality can have a very real impact on people's lives. If we gave everyone a box to stand on, some people still wouldn't be able to see the game, right? But recognizing that there are different abilities, different income levels, different heights, there's this recognition that sometimes some people need a little more help than others to get to the same place. Also keep in mind that whenever we're talking about justice, there's also questions of the, are we being effective? Are we being efficient? And then also, is what we're doing ethical? And that, whether or not something is ethical, again, is really complicated. But in the legal system, there are, principles that we generally think of in order to say, okay, was this fair or just? Did this meet the basic rules of law? And there are entire courses on each of these things. But the main thing is, generally we think of our system as being fair if the laws are written, they're written in an understandable way, they're applied forward, not backwards, right? You can't get in trouble for something you did 10 years ago if the law is just put on the books today. But there's also these ideas of due process. Are you being tried in the jurisdiction that you actually supposedly did the activity in, right? Is your case being handled with procedural fairness, right? All of these different things. There is also an idea of fairness when it comes to number 7 there you see at the bottom, no cruel and unusual punishment. Everyone usually gets on board with this idea. It's even part of the Constitution via the 8th Amendment. But what counts as cruel and unusual punishments is more of a matter of debate. And most of that debate, we oftentimes will focus on the death penalty or life imprisonment. But we also need to think about the lower level things, fees and fines, how much of a fine is considered appropriate. If we were doing $1 million fine for jaywalking, I think most people would be repelled by that. And so as we move through the justice system and thinking about what do we want it to look like, how do we want it to function, we have to keep in mind this fairness aspect, recognizing that depending on what someone does and depending on their situation, the punishment can have very different impacts. Miriam? All right, and so for the next couple of slides, I just want to highlight a couple of things that you may already know, but I want you to keep in mind. One, when we talk about law, there are different types of law. There's substantive and procedural. So if we're talking about, it's against the law to murder someone, that's a substantive law, right? It's actually saying what is and isn't okay. We're focused a lot on procedural laws, which have to do with how a case is processed through the criminal justice system. But also, what does the judge have to consider when making a sentencing decision? Those sorts of things fall into this. And so fees and fines largely fall under this idea of procedural laws. And as you already know, obviously, we have a very diverse system of government. We talk about it as government or the criminal justice system, but there are lots of different lanes and avenues. So at every level of government, we've got the 3 branches: legislative branch, making the laws, writing the laws, the executive branch carrying them out, and the judicial branch is interpreting those. The reason this is important and why I'm bringing it up again is as we talk about fees and fines and some of the problems and the effects, keep in mind that some parts of government have the ability to write and change those rules, whereas some are expected to carry them out and don't have as much say. So legislative branch is writing most of those rules, but keep in mind the executive branch and the judicial branch, they can also have branch-wide policies that affect fees and fines. And again, there's a lot of different sources of law. So when we're talking about reform, and the Campaign to End Debtors Prison is focused primarily at Delaware state laws. We also have to take into consideration federal rules and requirements. Oftentimes, federal funding is tied to how states write their laws at the state level. And so each of these things are unique and have their own processes, but they are also interconnected. And so it makes it a much more complicated process in, identifying, well, who has the authority to actually make changes to these rules and how can we change it without affecting other things? We often talk about our criminal justice system as a picket fence, right? So if you think of a picket fence, you've got your posts, and then you've got your boards that are running across it, and then you've got all of the pickets on your fence. That's very much similar to how we have our legal system set up in the United States. We've got multiple levels of government. We've got the multiple branches of government. And again, as I said, we're focusing primarily on the state level, so state government, state legislator, and the state courts. And then finally, I want to make sure everyone is narrowing in on that we are focused primarily on fees and fines that are associated with the criminal justice system. We're not talking about disputes, marital law, corporate law. We are specifically focusing on fines and fees that someone is assessed if they are processed through the criminal courts in Delaware and are found guilty. We often will think about crime in multiple levels on our rule books, right? In the statutes, it's broken down into misdemeanors and felonies, and there's even different levels within those categories. Fees and fines can be associated with all criminal cases. If you get a public defender, for instance, it doesn't matter if it's for a misdemeanor or a felony, that there's still that fee that is involved with it. However, I want you to keep in mind that when we're talking about fees and fines and the impact of fees and fines, we're largely talking about people who are only involved in misdemeanors, in part because fees and fines are a primary way that is used when dealing with crime before we get to incarceration. It's this lower level intermediate area. Because it's not in prison, it gets ignored or forgotten about. It's not as sexy of a topic or as upsetting for a lot of people. But I want you to keep in mind that the vast majority of crimes are misdemeanors. The vast majority of cases in our court system are misdemeanors. And so although we are only talking really primarily about misdemeanors, it's a big chunk of the pie. All right.
Tanya,
Yeah.
are the fees and fines affecting people accused but not found guilty?
So the fines are absolutely only for people found guilty because it's that punishment part. Most fees are only assessed if someone is found guilty, but there are jurisdictional differences. Some areas, some states will do things a little bit differently. But, and Miriam and Lynn, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that in Delaware, they are only associated with people or assessed to people who have been convicted although there are some types of assessments people are required to get if they want to have a particular plea deal, and they have to pay that assessment even before they have agreed to a plea deal. So it gets complicated, and I'm going to let Miriam speak to that.
Yeah, I was just going to add, that's definitely right. In Delaware, the fines and fees that we're talking about primarily here are only imposed for people that are convicted either through a plea or after a trial. However, there are still often people do have expenses, although they're not technically the fines and fees that we're talking about here, that could be when they don't have a conviction. So if, there are a lot of programs in Delaware courts that involve getting drug treatment or mental health treatment in order to get your case dropped. And that usually involves the person paying out of pocket for it. It's not always out of pocket. It's not there. The courts, I want to give the courts credit where credit is due. There are a lot of programs that don't require folks to pay things, but a lot require people to pay out of pocket in order for their charges to be dropped.
All right. And so focusing more in on Delaware, but also still remembering that it's a really complicated system. We talk about the Delaware courts as though they're this, one entity. And in some ways they are, because they all fit into a particular hierarchy structure. And, there's the administrative office of the courts, which helps do some, umbrella things. But the courts operate like a lot of different chiefdoms. If you're more familiar with corrections, think about how, there is the Department of Corrections, but each and every facility has their own warden, and each and every block has their own culture, right? It's very much the same way in the court system. So we have the state court system. We don't have county courts here in Delaware, but we have 6 different courts. And that fit into the state system. And then we also have some alderman courts that are at the municipal level. So with fees and fines, when we're talking about criminal justice, keep in mind, actually, Miriam, will you go back real quick? Sorry. With the fees and fines that we're talking about, we are, we're not talking about the Supreme Court, although they do hear some criminal cases, it's, those are appeals. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about Court of Chancery, because that is purely civil. As Miriam was saying, her previous life was spent there. But Superior Court, Court of Common Pleas, Family Court, and especially Justice of the Peace are hearing lots of cases that are criminal cases and have fees and fines assessed with them. All right, now I'm ready, Miriam. All right. So this is a flow chart of the criminal justice system that's almost always used to teach students about the criminal justice system. And this one image can overwhelm a lot of people, but keep in mind, all of those slides that I just made you suffer through, and I kept talking about like, oh, and there's divisions and there's layers. And now imagine this criminal justice system, which isn't all that clear cut in the first place. I don't even know if it's even appropriate to truly call it a system. Like with my digestive system, food goes in one place and it comes out another, and there's a certain step that happens at every organ in between. But in the criminal justice system, people can actually be in multiple places at once. They can be involved in multiple jurisdictions. So all of those different layers, it is not nearly this clean cut. So when people have fees and fines, if they've had cases in more than one court, or if they, if their case got broken up at some point, they might actually have fees and fines in multiple courts. And they can, ideally we want everyone to succeed and pay off everything and, move out of the system. But if you look about, I don't know, the orange, if you look in the orange around where it says intermediate sanctions, right there in the middle, that's what we're talking about. Those folks in that area, they have made it all the way through the system, have been found guilty or pled guilty, and then as part of their sentence, they are required to pay fees and fines. Those are intermediate sanctions. But you see, although the main bar goes towards out of the system, there are two areas that shoot off. There's one that shoots up to prison, and there's one that shoots down to jail. The reason for that is, even if someone has no incarceration as part of their sentence, there's, hey, you need to pay these financial obligations, and that's going to be your punishment. If they fail to do so, they can then get funneled into our jail and prison. So in Delaware, they're the same facilities, but typically jails and misdemeanor prisons are for felonies, simply for not being able to pay the fee and fine that you are assessed at sentencing. The judge assessed that because they decided jail or prison is not an appropriate punishment, even if it's a possibility according to statute. And yet, if someone doesn't have enough money, they can end up in those places anyways. All right, and I'm hopefully going to be wrapping up here in a few minutes, but a couple more distinctions that it's important to make. We talk about sentencing and punishment as a stage of the criminal justice system a lot of times. Sentencing and punishment aren't technically the same thing. The sentence is the court order that the judge writes or has their personnel write out that states what the convicted person has to do following the conviction, right? It can, it can be that they have to avoid certain places. It can be that they have to pay fees and fines. Punishment is the part of that sentence that is the infliction or imposition of pain, even if it is financial discomfort, having to pay some type of money to, it's the actual, like slap on the wrist that we talk about. The sentence is the order saying slap that person on the wrist. The punishment is the actual slap. Keep in mind, sentencing, there are guidelines that are involved. We have statutes that say what is an appropriate, you have this window that you can sentence someone to if they are found guilty for this particular crime. There are sentencing guidelines. The courts have their own court rules that help guide judges in making these decisions. But there are also influences such as, what kind of mood the judge is in that day. Which judge is your case being heard by? Some of the judges, they believe that they should be able to use every stick that's available to them. And other judges are like, hey, I would much rather use a carrot if I can, and I don't want to use the sticks unless I have to. Whether or not the judge has eaten can influence these kinds of decisions. There's research that shows the time of day and if it's before or after lunch can influence the kinds of sentences and therefore the punishment that someone receives. And then in this area of discretion, there are pros and cons to discretion. If you have a lot of discretion, there is, concern, okay, well, what if the person doesn't treat people equally? But there is also the recognition that our system really can't function and be fair or feel just if there isn't discretion. Because remember what I said all the way at the beginning, yeah, there's procedural justice, treating everyone alike, but there's also this concept of distributive justice and wanting to make sure to take that nuance into consideration. There are a lot of people in our system that have discretion. Oftentimes in sociology, we'll talk about them as street level bureaucrats. These are people that are at the front line, whether they're taking your money at the collections office or the judge that is overseeing your case. Because they are interpreting policy and then carrying it out, their discretion in a way creates policy and action. So we have law on the books, what's written in statute, but then there's also how individuals and individual organizations choose to carry that out, which can have a big impact. So part of what we've been doing as the campaign is to try to address legislation, but also work with some of these organizations so that they can encourage the people in their wheelhouse to use discretion in useful ways, right? To try to take into consideration, well, is someone actually going to be able to pay that bill if we charge them that? All right, I think I covered this one. So if you would just skip this slide, and I'm happy to share them with people if you want. But I just want to make sure to keep rolling. Again, there's a lot of different forms of punishment. Because we are focusing primarily on debtor's prison and a large part on those misdemeanors, we're primarily looking at the very bottom of this list, focusing on fines and fees, loss of rights and privileges such as driver's licenses. There's shame, that's a part of a conviction, as well as if you lose your right to drive and having to stand out at the bus stop, there is oftentimes a feeling of shame that's involved in that. So it's an indirect form of punishment. And then community service is also an option that comes into play. When we are talking about punishment, we need to think about, well, why are we punishing? If we want to have an effective system and we want it to be efficient and all this, well, what's our goal in the first place? So there are 4 primary reasons identified for punishment. First one is retribution, to get vengeance. You did something wrong, and so we want to get back at you, right? There's the idea of deterrence. This idea that, okay, well, if we punish someone, if we do that slap on the wrist, they won't do this act again. And possibly anyone who saw it is also going to be deterred from doing this. Incapacitation, simply keeping someone from being able to do that, to do crime again. And rehabilitation, figuring out, well, what caused that person to commit a crime in the first place? And how can we change that person or their environment, give them new skills so that they won't repeat that action. All right. And then restitution is sometimes talked about, but I think it's really important to keep in mind, restitution is not a part of punishment technically. Punishment is about, what is being inflicted on the person who's been convicted to address them and their relationship with the system. Restitution is completely different. That has to do with restoring a victim, and in the campaign, we are not focused on that area, in part because it's, it's a separate issue outside of our wheelhouse. Right. So again, with this slide, I just want you to keep in mind that although we often are talking about mass incarceration and concerns about our criminal justice system, vast majority of people that are in the criminal justice system are actually on probation and are not actually in our jails and prisons. So there are millions of people that are affected by fees and fines and the different collateral consequences that are associated with those, being on probation, having regular appointments, that sort of thing. So again, fees and fines is what we're focusing on. Fines are the monetary charge intended as punishment. Fees are a part of the sentence, but they are more so to collect revenue for our system. This is just one slide that you can look at to see how Delaware compares to some other states. In looking at just juvenile court costs, fees and fines, you can see that we're in the dark orange there. Delaware has 6 different kinds, not just 6 fees, but 6 different kinds of fees and fines that are applied to juveniles. So you can imagine when we go to the adult world, how punitive Delaware is in this regard. A big issue, although there is this ideal that, okay, if we charge people fees and fines, they'll pay that and then they'll know better and they won't do these things again in the future, is that although that's very rational, most people are not operating in a perfect world. And so most people that get involved in the criminal justice system suffer from poverty and lack of resources. So they have an inability to pay these kinds of fines and fees, which can result in them losing their driver's license, possibly losing their job, getting arrested, not being able to work, and then again, that contributes to them not being able to pay. I love talking about collateral consequences and sanctions, but for this purpose, just keep in mind that although we are starting out talking about money for, a misdemeanor, the effects of being on probation, or especially if you get pulled into the jail system because of inability to pay, it can affect where you're able to live. It can affect your insurance rates. It can keep you from going to school and so on. And I think I have just one or two more things here. A couple of myths that I want you guys to be aware of. We oftentimes think we need fees and fines to deter people from committing crime, but as I just said, not only does it not keep people from committing crimes, there's actually research that shows that almost 40% of people that had fees and fines considered committing another crime just to pay off their court debt so that they wouldn't have their driver's license suspended or possibly be thrown in jail for not being able to pay. Additionally, there's this idea of, well, we have to have people paying fees and fines because how else would we pay for our system? One, the amount of money that is brought in through the courts is actually quite small compared to what the courts assess. It's very ineffective. And if we were to try to collect this same money through taxes, it would actually be 121 times more effective, more efficient. So I just wanted to dispel some myths there. And so wrapping up, I want you guys to continue thinking about, is our system of fees and fines just? When we think about criminal justice, is this just? Is it helping rehabilitate people? No. Do fees and fines incapacitate people to keep them from committing future crimes? No. It's not like if you have someone who is charged for murder, well, one way of keeping them from murdering people is, to keep them in jail. With fees and fines, if someone jaywalked, having them pay money doesn't actually keep them from being able to jaywalk. It also doesn't deter crime, because as I showed you earlier, in some cases, it actually will increase criminal activity if people are stressed about paying their fees and fines. And so really it comes down to if out of the 4 different reasons for punishing people don't make sense with fees and fines, why are we doing it? And really it just comes down to retribution, that we feel like we need to punish people, but we're then not thinking about the long-term effects. So I went over, I apologize.
That's okay. Before you go on, we do have another question.
Sure.
It's from Marge Johnson. Aren't there also fees associated with being in prison?
Right. So we haven't gone into it a whole lot in our current efforts, since we've this year been focusing a lot on fees and fines that are not prison related. But absolutely, when people are incarcerated, the amount it costs to call families, to be able to have access to menstruation products, all sorts of things are an exorbitant cost in our facilities. And so if someone with fees and fines is unable to pay them, and they are one of the people who are then pulled into our jails, they can have not only inability to make money because they can't get to their job, but they may also accrue additional fees while in prison.
And just
Thank
a
you.
little more on that. Some jurisdictions do actually charge people for the time that they spend in jail, like a per diem to pay for their own incarceration. Delaware doesn't do that. Thank God. There are sometimes some charges for certain types of probation, And there is a probation fee for anyone that's put on probation, but Delaware does not charge people explicitly for being incarcerated. Although, as Tanya mentioned, they do charge for commissary, for phone access, and the phone access thing in particular has been a hot topic during COVID because the prisons have not allowed in-person contact to at all for large parts of the pandemic. And they did create a new policy where everyone incarcerated has, I don't remember exactly how much time it is, but everyone got some free phone time. But for folks that were seeing family regularly, it's considerably less time for free than they would generally spend seeing the people they love. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about specifically how fines and fees work in Delaware. And for this, I'm going to show you guys this. I'm going to show you guys the real things that people get when they are sentenced. Oops. I'm going to click through real fast first. There we go. So I'm going to show you the real things that people are given when they're sentenced in Delaware. This is a truth in sentencing form. It's what the judges actually fill out. This is a real one that was really filled out by a judge. And it's what the judges fill out when they're sentencing someone. Usually, most people that are convicted of a crime in Delaware are convicted after they plead guilty. And so generally someone would just stand up in court in front of a podium. If they have an attorney next to them, that attorney would say they went over a guilty plea form with them and that they think that they're entering the conviction, the plea, knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily. The judge would ask them how they plead, they would say guilty, and then the judge would literally read this form. So they would say, on the 31st day of March 2021, it is the sentence of the court that the defendant pay the cost of prosecution and all statutory surcharges for the offense of, and fill it in. You'll notice here, this is a real form that was given to someone. It's not filled in. And that's how a lot of things work. Things are done fast. And so not everything is filled in. It is handwritten. It's often difficult to read. But on this form, there are just, there we go. There are just two parts that speak to fines and fees. The first is this beginning where it says pay the cost of prosecution and all statutory surcharges. And this person was sentenced to probation with a $100 fine. That's pretty typical. A lot of misdemeanors in Delaware, someone's only going to get a fine. And if they get more than a fine, they'll be getting a low level of probation. This person was giving level 1 probation, which is the lowest level in Delaware. This is a very common sentence. Because this person was represented by me, I asked that the fines and fees that were able to be waived were waived. And so that second part over here where it says pay a surcharge of $100 is represented by the public defender's office. It's scratched out and it says waived. Also pay a fee of $200 to probation and parole, waived. Those are not always waived. Some, like Tanya talked about, judges have discretion and some judges never waive those. And some attorneys don't ask for them to be waived. And sometimes it's just not possible for them to be waived. So this person had a $300 break on their bill, but most people don't. This is the next piece of paper that they're given. If it was in court in person, they would be given this in the hallway after they go outside. If for most of the time that I've been practicing, they actually wouldn't get that other piece of paper. They would not ever be given this. They would only get this when they go out into the hall. And in really small print here, you'll see that it says that this person was ordered to pay $260 to the Court of Common Pleas. It then says what'll happen if you don't pay. It says a warrant will be issued, your driver's license may be suspended, and you may be charged a fee for a capias if they put out a capias for failure to pay. There's some instructions on the bottom that say you can make a payment online. There's the address of the courthouse. And there's a phone number, which is just the main phone number for the courthouse. This is the last piece of paper that people are given. This is the only thing that actually spells out what fines and fees were imposed on this person and how it started at $100 plus prosecution costs and then ended up at $260. So this is really what it looks like. It really is this hard to read. There's one line and then another line, and it has these kind of opaque things where it just says state police 750, local enforce 750, ambulance 10. And then you'll see that a couple of them are blank. Supervision is not filled in. That would have been the probation fee. There's also a spot somewhere on here where, yep, it's right above. So there's video phone fee or VidFo fee, that's $1. Right above that, hard to read, but it's pub def fee, and that's the $100 public defense fee that was waived. Now, what do these things actually mean?
Miriam?
yeah.
There was a question in the chat saying, what if they leave before someone finds them to give them the paper in the hallway?
What was that, sorry?
What if they leave before someone finds them to give them the paper in the hallway?
It happens all the time. So in person, when we had court in person, you would go up at the podium and then you're told to wait in the hallway, and it's this big giant hallway and you sit on a bench. And if you're lucky, it could be 5 minutes. There's one like half window and you wait for that to open and for someone to call your name. If you're lucky, it's just a couple minutes. If you're unlucky and it's a really busy day for the courts, it's usually just one person back there calculating everyone's fines and fees. And so, you know, on a busy day, I practice in the Court of Common Pleas, you could have hundreds of people on one morning, and it's just one or two people calculating all of their bills. And so you might wait a couple hours to get this paperwork. And I certainly have seen people leave without getting it. Sometimes people are confused. They don't know that they're supposed to wait there for it. They think it's done. Sometimes they have to get to a job or they have to pick up their child. And so sometimes people don't have a choice. Right now, with COVID, what's been happening with a lot of cases is these forms are emailed to the attorney that represented someone, and then we get it to them. If I have a client who has email, then I will email it to them and they get it pretty quickly, just as soon as the court gets it to me, which has been anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks. Yeah. And if it's someone that doesn't have email, then I'm calling them to let them know they're getting it. I'm usually telling them that what's on it, and then I'm mailing it physically to them, which, as you guys know, lately, that could be 5 days, you know, for it to be processed and get to them, or it could be 2 weeks, or sometimes it just seems to never get to them. I'm not really sure what happens there. But that's a really good question. Sometimes people never get this paperwork. So what did all that stuff on the paperwork mean? Started off with a $100 fine. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. There was a $55 non-jury trial fee. That is a fee that's in the Court of Common Pleas. If you waive your right to a jury trial at the initial stages of a case, you were charged $55 in court costs. If you don't waive your right to a jury trial, you were charged $135. So it is more expensive if you don't waive your constitutional rights. There's a $10 court security assessment that is legislatively imposed. It goes to pay for bailiffs. There's a $1 video phone fund, $1 Delgis fund, $15 to the Fund to Combat Violent Crimes is what it's called. And that was the $750 and $750. It's split between state police and local law enforcement. $10 to the Volunteer Ambulance Company Fund, $10 to the Victims Compensation Fund. And then I put the things that were waived here in yellow: $100 public defender fee. That's if you're represented by a public defender or any other type of court-appointed attorney. And then $200 for being sentenced to probation. So for this person, they had $202 on these extra costs. If you didn't have all those fees waived, you could be looking at $502. And then finally, that CAPEAS fee that I mentioned, where it had on the form you might be charged for getting a CAPEAS, that's $20 each time. So breaking that down, the $100 fine is the deterrent or punishment, going back to what Tanya was talking about. And then the $402 are court costs, and those are the fees. Many, but not all of these are set by the General Assembly. They've been created over time. It wasn't all in one go. These used to not exist though. It used to be that people would just get a fine And then volunteer ambulance companies need more money. Well, we don't want to increase taxes, so we will add this court fee, and we'll get money for it that way. We need to fund the criminal background check system. Well, we don't want to get that from the general fund where it's coming from income taxes, so we will add a $1 Delges fund fee to every conviction in Delaware. That's how all of these things were created. Some of them are court created. There are a couple that are court created, but a fair number of them are created by the legislature, and the courts don't have any discretion to waive them. The same thing when it comes to fines. And there's a lot of talk about mandatory minimum jail sentences and getting rid of those. We also have mandatory minimum fines on a lot of cases. $100 is what often comes out as a discretionary fine. But certain charges in Delaware do have mandatory minimum fines. The favorite one that I like to mention, because I think it's pretty egregious, is if you are charged with driving a car that does not have insurance, there is a $1,500 mandatory minimum fine for that. And when you add on the court costs, one of the court costs on here is to the Transportation Trust Fund. That's 50% added on to any traffic related charge. So for a $1,500 fine, you have another $750 to the Transportation Trust Fund. And then you have all of these other piecemeal things as well. And the primary reason that people are driving cars that are uninsured is because they could not afford insurance. So I'm not sure that's the most logical, but that's what the court costs look like right there. The reason that this is such a problem is because most people can't afford a $500 bill. The US Federal Reserve had a report in, this is for, I think this one's for 2018, it was the same in 2019, that found that for 27% of people, if they had an unexpected $400 expense, they would have to borrow or sell something in order to afford that $400 expense. For an additional 12% of people, they would simply not be able to afford it at all. They couldn't borrow it. They couldn't sell something to afford that. They could not afford $400 if it came unexpectedly. That means that almost 40% of people cannot afford an unexpected $400 expense, which essentially means that almost 40% of people cannot afford even a basic assessment of court fines and fees in Delaware. So I think, for a lot of us, being able to afford $500, being able to afford $100, it's achievable. We might have that in a bank account. We might be able to sell something for it. We might be able to borrow it from a family member. This is a chart that shows what a $100 fine might feel like if you were at the federal poverty level, or if you were, and this says minimum wage, but it has it at $12 an hour. We all know that is not the minimum wage in Delaware, although hopefully soon it will be. But so this says what it would feel like if you were being paid minimum wage at $12 an hour, 40 hours a week, so full time, or at the federal poverty level. And then I put in here, this is an editable chart. I put in here a sample salary. I have it at $206,000, $206,148. That's just a total random number. It happens to match the salary of the Chief Justice of Delaware, but just a totally random number for you guys. So for someone at the federal poverty level, that $100 fine is over 6%. Sorry, for someone at minimum wage, that $100 fine is actually 6% of their income, versus someone at the federal poverty level, you're looking at 9.4% of their income. For someone making $206,000, the equivalent fine on someone, so if a $100 fine for someone at the federal poverty level is 6.1% of their salary, at the minimum. I keep saying the wrong numbers, but luckily you guys have the chart in front of you, so you can correct it for me. But for someone making $206,000, the effect and what it feels like to get a $100 fine is actually what it feels like to get a $9 fine. If you were making $12 an hour, or a $6 fine if you're at the federal poverty level. To put that another way, the fine equivalent at minimum wage for what it feels like for someone at minimum wage. I feel like I'm describing this weird, but luckily, again, you guys have the chart. If you were making $206,000, to have 6% or 9% of your salary, we're talking about $1,000 fine or $1,600 fine is what the equivalent would feel like to you. So let's add in the court costs. If we change that $100 fine to a $502 total amount, we're actually talking about a $5,000 fine. If you're making $200,000, we're talking about $5,000 is how much that fine should be for it to be equivalent to you as it is to someone making making minimum wage, versus $8,000 for it to be equivalently felt on you at $200,000 total income as it does to someone at the federal poverty level. And right now in Delaware, the courts don't have any discretion to do this kind of thing. If you are making $200,000, or if you are making, $200,000, or if you're making the federal poverty level, you are still getting $502 in court costs. It does not matter. And so something that our campaign believes in is that your court costs, your fines, should take into account how much money you're making, because it's not fair that someone who has a lot of money, it's going to feel like $9. And someone who's not making any money, it feels like $100, and it feels like their money for that month or those months that they're making those payments. I'm not going to force everyone to do this, but we'll share the slides afterwards. And there's a link in here to an editable version of that calculator. I really welcome everyone, put in how much you make. See what $100 fine to someone at the federal poverty level would feel like to you. And think about what sacrifices you would have to make if you suddenly got a $1,500 bill that you weren't expecting, or a $6,000 bill that you weren't expecting. Would you be able to afford groceries that month? Would you have to maybe sell your car? Think about what it would do to you. So I know one of the big things we often think about with the justice system is, oh, well, people, you did the crime, you got to do the time. But Tanya mentioned this. In reality, most people that are in the justice system are there for crimes, are there for misdemeanors. 97% of all crimes or violations filed in Delaware in 2019 were for misdemeanors. So the chart that Tanya showed, it's actually more like this giant heaping thing, and then this tiny little thing on top. It's not really a pyramid. It's like a plateau with like a little doohickey on top. And interestingly, in Delaware, we actually have the highest per capita arrest rate for misdemeanors in the country. There was a recent 50-state survey that went over all criminal filings in all the states. And I think Tanya mentioned this, but most criminal cases are done at the state level. They're not done at the federal level. So really talking about states, that's where the justice system is. It's in the state legal system. So Delaware actually has the highest per capita arrest rate for misdemeanors in the country. So we are imposing this system on more people than anyone else. So when people have these fees and fines and they can't pay them, they incur more debts through KPS fees. Their driver's licenses are suspended. They are issued arrest warrants. And lastly, they go to prison. We have data from the Department of Corrections that the Delaware Center for Justice had gotten, that in the first 6 months of 2018, there were 129 people sentenced to prison only for failing to pay Delaware court-ordered fines and fees. And as Tanya mentioned, we don't have local jails in Delaware. So anyone that's going to jail, I make a point actually when I talk to people to not say jail. I like to say prison, because if you're a woman in Delaware, we have one institution, it's Baylor. And whether you're going there because you didn't have fines and you had fines and fees you couldn't pay, and after going through that system, a judge eventually decided to incarcerate you, or if you murdered someone, you go to the same place. You're not going to be in the same pod. Again, to give them credit where credit is due, you're probably not going to be next to that, probably not going to be next to each other, but you're going to the same place. You go to prison. And it's the same for men. We only have a couple, a few institutions, and there are no local jails. You go to prison. So this is a huge problem. In 2017 in Delaware, there were over 20,000 driver's licenses suspended for court-ordered fines and fees. There were also over 44,000 warrants for failure to pay, and that was only for non-felony offenses. Something I like to mention here is there are only just around 1 million people in Delaware. So we are suspending a significant number of driver's licenses when you take into account how many people actually are even here. And then we're sending out a significant number of arrest warrants when you consider how many people even exist in this state. So with that, I think I'm having trouble seeing the chat when I'm screen sharing, but I think I saw some. Does anyone have any questions? Nope. Okay. Then I'm going to turn it over to Lynn.
All right. Thank you, Miriam. I'm going to talk about solutions now that Miriam and Tanya have laid out the issue and the problems. But I'm going to try to go through it rather quickly so that we do have plenty of time to engage in some dialogue and get to some questions from the audience. So I'll talk about in solutions what we should do, which includes long-term fixes to the problem, what we can do in terms of what is really doable in the short term, maybe even this legislative session, and then the how are we going to do this? How are we going to tackle and make the progress we need to make? So Miriam, go ahead and put up the first slide. So in terms of what we should do to fix the system, the first is very clear from what was laid out, that we need to simply end the practice of using court fees to fund government services. Recognizing, of course, the corollary to that is that we have to pay for current services, including ambulance and everything else, out of the general fund. So either by raising taxes or cutting spending or finding other means of paying for it. That's why that one is such a big lift and clearly is not something that's going to happen overnight. That's something that we really need to get people to understand the need to change how we fund those and get them to buy into those changes and make them happen. So that's regarding the fees. When it comes to the punitive fines, we want to ensure that they are fairly imposed. We also want to ensure that the enforcement of any unpaid debt, and I'm also going to sneak another term in here, failure to appear in court. We want to make sure that enforcement of those is effective and efficient. And finally, we want to equitably deal with accumulated past debt and related consequences. So even after we fix the current system, let's make sure we can retroactively take care of the folks who have been hurt so much by the current system. Next slide. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail of what this looks like. So for ensuring that the punitive fines and measures are fair, we want to waive fines for people that can't afford them, prorate them for low-income offenders based on their ability to pay. For juveniles or children, we want to just simply get rid of them. There's no point to be charging children fines of any kind. We want to make sure there are good payment plan options. And we also want to redefine what the current work referral system so that community service can include other things that will benefit the person or their community, such as substance abuse programs and mental health services. And finally, in terms of making the system fair and usable, we need to consolidate the system so that people can easily see how much they owe in court costs and can easily make payments. Next slide. And to ensure that enforcement is effective and efficient, we really absolutely need to cease suspending driver's licenses for any reasons unrelated to driving. Anything other than that is not only illogical, but as we've pointed out, is counterproductive. And so we really like to see not only ending that for failure to pay fines and fees, but also failure to appear in court and failure to pay child support. Because there are federal funds tied to using Driver's license suspension for failure to pay child support. We need to be careful not to completely end it completely, but leave it so that it can still be used in really terrible cases. And finally, we want to stop the issuance of KPSs for failure to pay court debt, except as a last resort. Next slide. And finally, to equitably deal with what has already occurred, we want to immediately restore eligibility for driver's licenses and waive the reinstatement fee. So all those people who have lost their licenses can get them back. And also implement a mechanism to erase or lessen existing debt. Next slide. Okay, so all of those you can see cumulatively are a pretty big lift. So what can we do now, and in particular this legislative session? Our Campaign to End Debtors Prison is focused at the state level with an eye to eventually doing municipalities. We want to eliminate a few fees as a first step, recognizing we won't be able to eliminate them all at once. Take first major steps to improving the system. Won't completely fix it, but at least improving the system of imposing and enforcing the punitive fines and measures. Form a study group to recommend the further improvements that need to be made, and mandate collection of certain data, including the requirement that municipalities, law enforcement agencies, and courts track and disclose how much of their budgets come from fines and fees. And this will help not only inform what needs to be fixed and where new revenue sources need to be generated, but it will hopefully help make the case for why this really needs to be changed. Next slide. So just a little bit more detail in terms of the first step towards eliminating fees, the ones that we think is doable this legislative session and are pushing to have incorporated into the bill, is to stop the fees for being represented by a public defender, stop the KPS fees for failure to pay, and the fees for using a kiosk simply for making a payment. So those are the fees that we think would be the easiest to take away in the first round.
Excuse me, Lynn, can you explain KPSs?
I could, but my layman terms probably won't make as much sense as Miriam or Tanya. So let me.
KPS just means bench warrant. So it's a warrant for arrest that's specifically issued by a judge or a court. It has two contexts in Delaware: failure to appear. So if someone doesn't go to an arraignment, a case review, a trial date, any kind of court hearing in a criminal case, they will get usually a failure to appear KPS, which is an arrest warrant for them to come in and explain where they were and maybe have their bail readdressed. The other type of KPS is for failure to pay, which is where when they have court costs, like we've talked about as a part of a criminal sentence, if they're often given payment plans. If you miss the payment plan and go down that road, the court will issue a failure to pay KPS. And both of those types of KPSs will immediately suspend your driver's license. And so we think that's illogical because if you can't pay money and they want you to pay money, you really need to be able to drive to your job. And if you didn't make it into court, you really need to be able to drive to the courthouse.
Thank you.
So very quickly, in terms of improving the system for making it more fair when fines are imposed, we've gotten a lot of pushback from the courts not wanting to have to do ability to pay hearings and have to do a whole income assessment. So at a first pass, we're looking at simple automatic triggers that we would waive the fines for people who cannot afford them based on being represented by a public defender or anyone who the state has already deemed poor by them receiving needs-based public assistance or benefits, as well as getting rid of the fines for all children. So we think these are the most doable in terms of improving the system, which still leaves the long list that was on the previous slide of things that we'll need to go after in another future session. In terms of the enforcement, almost all of the things that we talked about enforcement, we think we can get improving enforcement, we can get done this time because there is a lot of buy-in to stopping the practice of suspending driver's licenses. I think folks really recognize how counterproductive that truly is. So we're hoping to get all of that in this session. So our path to progress is very simply directly engaging the key decision makers and influencers. We've had really good conversations, not only with the Department of Justice and the courts and the bill sponsor, but also the Lieutenant Governor and someone at the Governor's office. So all the different key players and stuff are all important in the process. We want to continue to learn and do research and to educate others like you guys, sharing stories of those who are directly impacted, sharing the statistics and dollars that are flowing through the system when it comes to our fines and fees, and understanding the national landscape. Where does Delaware fit relative to what others doing? What are some best practices that we can learn about from other states? And then we'll use all the momentum that we're building by educating others and our partner relationships to put public pressure on the decision makers at all levels and at all stages of the process. Next slide. This is a list of our key partners. I'm not even going to take the time to go through them all. I think you guys recognize their names. Next slide. I also just want to recognize the national resources that we tap into. We've gotten some really good assistance from the Fines and Fees Justice Center, the Juvenile Justice Center, and the National ACLU in helping to even draft language that we can suggest to some of the key decision makers in terms of what could be incorporated in the bill for this session. And then I also want to recognize our own Senator Chris Coons for having just reintroduced the Federal Driving for Opportunity Act, which basically wants to create incentives for states to move away from suspending driver's licenses for these counterproductive enforcement needs. And so that is another resource that will hopefully make it easier for Delaware to implement the changes we're talking about implementing. Next slide. So what can you do to help now? One is that we have launched a letter writing campaign. We're hoping that anyone in the audience would like to participate in that. Right now, it's to influence the decision makers about what actually goes into the bill. We'll probably be doing another one later to help push the bill through the process. But right now, we really want the people who are still making decisions to be bold and put as much into the bill as possible. I have very little time to do it, but we also have recently started a fines and fees fund partnering with the Friendship House that will actually help offenders pay off fines and fees that are keeping them held down and in the debt trap. So you can make a donation by going to the Friendship House website and writing in fines and fees fund under special purpose. And finally, talk to anyone and everyone you know about it. The last slide is simply a list of resources that you can click on, including I'll highlight a webinar that Cami and several of us watched just a couple days ago by the American Bar Association, which was really well done and really sets the whole problem up well in terms of the need for change. So we will put a link in the chat to this presentation so that you will have all these additional links to work from. And with that, we will open it up to questions.
Okay, wonderful. Actually, I do have a question that I've been hanging on to. It's for Miriam. So we just want to understand correctly that if you couldn't pay your fines and a warrant is issued, is there a fine or a fee attached to the warrant?
Yeah, so let's say you had $300 in court costs still outstanding and you missed a monthly payment for that and they issued a warrant, you get another $20 added to that $300 you already owed. And they don't, I've had clients get a lot of them. You know, if you're struggling to make those monthly payments, I've seen people who have had, 50 KPSs issued for failure to pay. And that is $20 for each one of those.
Also, I just want to, Miriam, if you would speak to the fact that people can have multiple cases or multiple courts and therefore multiple KPSs for failure to pay.
Yeah, so whenever a KPS is issued, it's issued by case. And that's actually part of the issue within our system. The courts have it's a pretty archaic computer system that manages cases. And because of that, the different courts that Tanya highlighted, Justice of the Peace Court, Alderman's Court, CCP, Superior Court, they don't all talk to each other. And even within each court, if you often when you miss a payment, if you don't make any of your fines and fees payments 1 month, if let's say you had a speeding ticket in Newark, which was handled by Alderman's Court, and you had a disorderly conduct in Wilmington, which was handled by Justice of the Peace Court, say JP10. And then you had another disorderly conduct that maybe had another crime attached to it, or you just wanted a public defender, so you had it transferred to the Court of Common Pleas. That was Newcastle County Court of Common Pleas. And for each of those, you have $20 you have to make every month to pay off your $300 total court cost bill for each one. So you owe $900, you make $20 a month, and it goes to each of those $300 bills. If 1 month you can't pay that $60, you get 3 arrest warrants.
I have a question. Judy Taggart. Just within the last month or two, Newark City Council voted to add additional money to fees in the Alderman's Court. And I had trouble getting any information, and I usually kind of figure out how to work stuff, but what do you ask for and who do you go? Because I'm very curious now how much Newark Alderman's Court has attached to any kind of fee that someone gets when they're found guilty.
Yeah, the fee that I know of that they just added was a $10 ambulance company fund. And they specifically, in adding that, I think it was passed unanimously. In adding that, they were trying to mirror what happens at the state level, because there is a $10 ambulance company fund at the state level. The Alderman's courts are tough because those are run by each city that has an Alderman's Court, and it's all done through city council and legislation that they're passing. And that's one issue that we've really kind of had as a campaign. It's a capacity thing. We have all these state courts, and we can try to make this fines and fees system better by some of the legislative and advocacy things we're doing that Lynn mentioned at the state level. But even if we win on all those things and we get all the stuff that Lynn talked about that we're hoping will get past this next legislative session, if all that happens, it doesn't change that Newark Alderman's Court has all these fines and fees.
Yeah, what bothered me is I emailed my council person because it was like the day before when the agenda comes out or that Friday. And I emailed them, but I didn't know enough about it. I just told them I didn't support it. So I just was curious. I would like to try to find out what there is now. So who do I go to, and what do you know, or what do I ask for? What is it called?
Yeah, so a little bit of background on some of the research that we've done as a campaign. When I started as a public defender, I didn't, and most of the attorneys that I work with, private and public, don't know these different fees. And when a client pleads guilty to something, most attorneys representing that client can't tell them how much their total court costs will be. And so like a couple of years ago, this was a big thing that I did and others in our campaign did, to look into what fees there were at the state level, because we didn't know, and how they were each created. And now we know as a campaign exactly which part of Delaware code it comes from, or if it doesn't come from the state legislature. But one thing that I found really useful in doing that is most of the courts have a separate payment system. So the Court of Common Pleas in Delaware has a payment center. I can't remember if it's called, I think it's called like Customer Service Center or Payment Center. But they're actually very helpful people. And that was a great place that I found in researching that, is just calling them and saying, hey, if I have a speeding ticket for $50, what gets tacked onto that? I found it a little easier in person, which I know is difficult right now.
Yeah.
But that really helped me. And then the other thing is talk to people. Um,
Right.
like,
Yeah, I hate to interrupt, but we are coming to the end of our time. And okay, there you have it. We've had terrific information, and we know what needs to be done here. And this is a great group that I believe can make a difference. Um, let's see, we have some wonderful resources, and I'll see if we can follow up with an email to make sure that you do in fact have those resources. It's encouraging to know the great work of our presenters and the campaign to end debtors prison, and to be with you all this morning as we work to make Delaware more just and equitable. So thanks again to you all, and we hope we'll be in touch.
Mhm.